Beginning our afternoon is another gentleman that has experience in Western New York, a graduate of State University of New York at Buffalo, but also a fellow that had some experiences here in Marietta, having spent some of his time in his junior high years here in Marietta as a student. And when we were first talking about Matthew participating with us as a presenter at this conference, one of the first questions that came up when he heard where the university was located and where the event was being held was, what was the current status of the Big Chicken in Marietta? And we are planning a trip on the way to the airport by way of the Big Chicken, just for memory's sake, to make sure he understands that it's alive and well. Matthew Buttegens, as I said, lived in Cobb County for a portion of his life, and he completed his doctorate degree at State University of New York at Buffalo, and currently he is a senior research associate at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., where he leads the development of the Institute's health insurance policy simulation model. This model is currently being used to provide technical assistance for health reform implementation in Massachusetts, Missouri, New York, Virginia, and Washington, as well as to the federal government. His recent work includes a number of papers analyzing various aspects of national health reform, both nationally and state by state. Topics have included state-by-state analysis of change in healthcare insurance coverage and the remaining uninsured, and the role of the individual mandate, the affordability of coverage under health insurance exchanges, and the implication of age rating for the affordability of coverage. Speaking to us today on the status and the development of the insurance exchanges under the Patient Protection and Affordability Care Act from Washington, D.C. and the Urban Institute, Dr. Matthew Buttegens. Matt?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Klum, for that kind introduction. Okay, so what we'll be talking about, we'll begin with an overall picture of health insurance coverage in this country, as it is now, and as that would likely to change when health reform is fully implemented. So that sets the stage for what follows. Then we'll focus on the new health insurance exchanges. Now, they will be active for two types of consumers, for small businesses, and we've heard a lot about large employers and the influence large employers have in earlier presentations today and yesterday. And we'll take a closer look at small employers. Also, for the individual market, for individuals and families purchasing coverage directly from insurers, that market will be completely changed under the ACA. And then that's where we're going to spend most of our time. And then we will look a bit more at the individual mandate and what might happen if you left health reform in place and struck out the individual mandate. Though that I'm going to leave brief so that we have plenty of time for questions. And the clicker, there it is. Okay. So the model that I'm currently directing actually has a long history. I mean, it's more than a decade of development, and dozens of experts in various fields have contributed to it. I mean, this is a collaborative effort. So the rest of it you've already seen. So first of all, health insurance coverage under health reform. So on one side, we have the current picture. We have 50 million uninsured. Most Americans get their coverage through their employer, 150 million. Then we have 15 million who get their coverage in the direct market or the individual market. And then Medicaid and the CHIP program for children covers about 45 million. And then there are other public programs, that cover the remainder. Now, under health reform, as it's fully implemented, we would see the uninsured cut roughly in half, from 50 million to 26 million. So our estimates are a little bit lower than some of the figures that have come from some of the earlier CBO estimates. It's qualitatively, you can make essentially the same statement, that it would cut the uninsured in by roughly half. Now, where would that gain in coverage come from? Well, a great deal of it would come from the Medicaid expansion. So we've seen the uninsured, and also, with the uninsured, a significant portion of their health care costs are paid for not by the uninsured themselves, but by taxpayers and health care providers. And this would cut that by a little more than half. And again, that's not an assumption, that's the result of an analysis on the detailed characteristics of those who are currently uninsured. For Medicaid and CHIP, for the first time there will be a national eligibility standard at 138% of poverty that will apply to all. Currently, there are thresholds for children that are much higher in the CHIP program, and for adults, it varies state by state. There are some states for which there's only a tiny amount of income eligibility for parents, and none at all for non-parents. So that will change, and the vast majority of those becoming newly eligible will be adults, and a lot of them will be single adults and younger. So they'll look very different than the current Medicaid population. Okay, so that would expand the enrollment from 45 to 62 million. Okay, and again, the changes will vary considerably by state because the current eligibility rules vary so much from state to state. And also, I'd emphasize that some states would actually spend less on Medicaid under reform. That's because this sometimes gets lost, so I want to take a moment and do that. So for some states who have expanded coverage to adults already, under reform, the federal government would pay a higher share of their costs than they do now. So some states would realize savings under this expansion of coverage. Okay, now the private insurance market. So private insurance coverage overall would increase by 8 million. 5 million through employers, and 3 million through plans in the individual market. And this increase would be largely driven by the individual mandate that we saw, and also by subsidized coverage for low-income families who are not eligible for Medicaid. They're above that Medicaid eligibility threshold, or some legal immigrants who are below that eligibility threshold and not eligible for Medicaid. So those two factors would be the two major drivers of this increase in private coverage. It would also stabilize the private insurance market. And as we will see, it will provide the opportunity to really change the nature of that market, particularly for small employers and individuals. Now, what about the other half? The half that remains uninsured. Who are they? Well, 36% would be people who are eligible for Medicaid and CHIP but have not enrolled. I mean, you're never going to get 100% enrollment. So we've got 62 million enrolled, and we've got just over a third of this 16 million who have not enrolled. So that looks like a huge chunk, but that's sort of the remnant of a fairly high take-up rate. Undocumented immigrants, just over a quarter. There is nothing for undocumented immigrants in health reform. They're actually, not only are they not eligible for Medicaid or subsidies, but they cannot even purchase insurance in the exchanges with their own money. So needless to say, their coverage status is not likely to be very different than it is now. Now, of the remainder, we see about 1/5 would be exempt from the individual mandate because they would have no offer of coverage that was deemed to be affordable by the definition of the law. And that's a pretty strict definition. It's much stricter than what most of us would consider affordable. And then the remaining 1/5 of the uninsured would have an offer of affordable coverage, but would choose to risk paying the penalty rather than buying insurance. Okay, so now let's look at the health insurance exchanges. First, we'll focus on small businesses. Now, since many here are not just practitioners, but you're small business owners, this slide probably does not come as a surprise. There are many barriers to small businesses offering coverage to their workers. And I'll go through these points because then we'll match these up with ways the exchanges can potentially change that. So small business would have no dedicated human relations staff, to administer these plans, to shop for plans, to do that. I mean, large firms have dedicated full-time staff to do that. Smaller firms actually face higher administrative costs per worker than large firms. Volume reduces administrative costs. And also, the premiums that a small firm would face depends on the health status and the health spending of workers in that firm. Firms with or even one very high-cost worker may be essentially uninsurable because the employer just cannot afford the premium cost. Also, small businesses often have a very limited choice, particularly in rural areas. There may only be one carrier operating in that area, and some small employers can't get any carrier to bid on them at all. Okay, and in the background, coverage through employers has been steadily declining. We see in the lower line, this is by firm size, the smallest firms, those with 25 or less workers, that's been declining, and it's now approaching only 1/3 of workers in firms of less than 25 have coverage. We see higher levels for larger firms, but we see their levels too are declining. And the reason why is something that's cropped up over and over again in earlier presentations. The cost of health care, largely the cost of conventional medicine, rises much faster than wages or income. And as long as that continues, we will see this erosion in coverage. Okay, so how exactly can these exchanges potentially address these issues? So the exchange would essentially be a marketplace for insurance products that basically there would be a web interface for employers to choose between products and for their workers to choose between products. So it'll be a mix of both employer choice and worker choice between plans. And there'll be a lot more information about what is covered, what is not covered, customer satisfaction, speed of processing claims, all of these things that are often a black box in many states, and it's very difficult to make a choice between them. This is, a lot of this is going to be out in the open, transparent, and you'll be able to directly compare them. Also, there are several plans that are guaranteed to be in the exchange. So small businesses will have greater choice under these exchanges. Also, lower administrative costs, and a lot of the administrative costs could be handled through the exchange itself. So then the premiums would be based on pooling your employees with employees in other firms. So risk would be spread out much more broadly. So there's much less chance of becoming uninsurable because some of your workers incur high costs. Okay, and we've seen web-based comparison of plans. Also, who are the workers in small firms that are least well served by the current market? Well, part-time employees, part-time workers who work multiple jobs, and so on and so forth. So the exchange, and Utah's exchange is already designed to do this, could be portable. You could take it from one employer to another. You could have multiple employers, from you and your spouse, for multiple jobs that you have, all contribute something towards that premium. So there are other things that exchanges can do that aren't actually in the law, but that a state can do to make them better serve populations that they're currently not well served. Okay, so there are other employer-related provisions. There are, for the smallest firms and for firms up to certain wage criteria, they have to be fairly low wage. There are tax credits for purchasing insurance available up to 2 years. Also, the individual mandate would increase demand for coverage and draw healthier workers into the risk pool. And Medicaid would be available to more low-income workers as an affordable option. Now, that, depending on how a state does that, that could mean workers enrolling in Medicaid instead of the employer plan, or it could mean workers still enrolling in the employer's plan, and then Medicaid would reduce the premiums and provide extra benefits. So the states have either option. Okay, so we've seen that picture in the small group market, and so that's a lot of what's behind that rise of 5 million in the in employer coverage that we saw before. Now, the individual market is going to be very radically restructured. So already, exclusions for pre-existing conditions are banned, lifetime coverage limits are out. Yes, but things coming up, the premiums can only vary by age, tobacco use, and geography. And the amount of variation will be limited. So you can only charge your oldest enrollees up to 3 times as much as the youngest enrollees, for example. The market will be guaranteed issue. You can't be denied coverage if you apply. And then the essential health benefits standards. We've heard a lot about those already, and they will apply to both the individual and the small group market, and they will apply inside and outside the exchanges. They apply to the entire market. Okay, and there will be some standards as far as what share of your costs the insurer will cover, and there'll be standard tiers on that. That's a very complicated issue in itself, and there are some of your medical costs won't even be factored into that actuarial value thing, but that's another issue entirely. And also, there are minimum medical loss ratio requirements. So the amount that the amount that the insurer collects, 80% will have to go to actual funding of care rather than administrative costs or other spending. So that changes the entire market. Now, the health insurance exchanges, now what will they add in addition? Well, one, they are the vehicle for delivering subsidized coverage to low-income families who would not qualify for Medicaid. So these would be families between 138% of poverty and 400% of poverty who don't have an affordable offer of coverage from their employer. So that was put in there so you don't draw too many people out of the employer market. And that standard is pretty strict. If you have any offer of coverage from your employer, chances are it will be deemed affordable by the definition of the law. It's very difficult at that income level to have an offer that isn't affordable. Okay, so you have that population which you know will be in the exchange. But more generally, again, the whole concept of the exchange is to have a more open, transparent marketplace for consumers to shop for plans. They'll be able to compare the available plans side by side, see detailed benefits, how that might translate into costs, see consumer satisfaction ratings, the time that the time it takes insurers to pay claims, and any other anything else that a state wishes to include. So a lot of what is very difficult for consumers to find out about one plan, let alone compare it across plans, will be immediately available, and we'll see how that might play out shortly. Also, there would be the administrative costs of these plans would be lower than in the commercial market, similar to what we saw for small firms, and there's a potential for much greater plan choice. So, how many people are we talking about in these exchanges? So this is, if health reform is fully implemented and stabilized. So in the small business market, we could see nearly 10 million covered lives nationally. And in the individual market, about 17 million, just over half, would be in there because they're getting subsidized coverage. But the other half would be there because they chose to be there. Okay. So how does this tie in with many of the things that we've heard earlier? So we've heard about costs. We've heard about affordable care organizations, patient-centered medical homes, and value-based insurance benefits. Well, the exchanges actually sort of complete that picture of greater transparency of what things actually cost, what things are covered, and that. So basically, this actually brings individuals and small businesses into the picture, because currently, large businesses have some significant leverage over insurers and what things they cover, how the packages are designed. Small firms have virtually no leverage over insurers, and people going to the individual market have essentially no leverage with insurers. The exchange could change that, because here you have direct plan comparison, and you have immediate choice by insurers or by individuals and by small businesses. So basically, we heard earlier with Commissioner Sen's speech about how advocacy from chiropractic patients and alternative medicine patients in Washington led to changes in state law. Well, this gives that sort of advocacy a new forum that it never had before. And it allows small businesses to weigh in, very much in the way that large businesses can, and as we saw in other earlier presentations, are starting to. So this actually gives individuals and small firms a voice, in insurance and coverage. Okay. Oh yes, and as more on the essential health benefits plan. One crucial thing is that it applies to the individual market. Now, a lot of plans in the small firm market cover some chiropractic benefits right now, but that's much less common in the individual market. Well, the way the essential health benefit packages are designed, the choices that states have, it's going to be quite likely that the state benchmark will cover chiropractic in some form. So this would actually leverage greater coverage of chiropractic and alternative medicine in the individual market, as well as, and that will be a greater change than in the small firm market. So, and also mentioned we've heard about Washington and California in that. If you remember, so Commissioner Zen gave two quotes from a white paper from an insurer in Washington about the cost effectiveness of chiropractic. Well, the package that's going to be Washington's benchmark package is that insurer's product. So that should so that's an indication of what sort of leverage this essential health benefits benchmark package can accomplish. So in general, all of these things, the essential health benefits package, the standard coverage levels, and risk adjustment, which we haven't talked about too much. So basically, all of these provisions will make insurers compete more on pricing and value and give more transparency rather than competing by drawing healthier risk than their competitors. Now, there still will be opportunities for them to distinguish themselves by selecting risk post-reform, but this provides some very real limitations on that. Okay, so also dovetailing with some of the other things that we've heard. So basically, the two main problems in healthcare in this country, you have coverage and then you have costs. And actually, the state of Massachusetts, when they did their health reform, they explicitly separated the two, and they enacted the coverage part of it in 2006, and the costs, well, that's sort of they're sort of discussing it at the moment. So the second part really got delayed. Under the ACA, there was an attempt to sort of do both at once. And the coverage provisions, that's more institutional and administrative, and that's something you can, that it's easier to implement and make effective quickly. Whereas cost controls, as we've seen, is much more controversial because obviously all of those costs are someone's revenue. So yes, we've seen a lot on the delivery side with ACOs and medical homes and so on and so forth. So the exchanges on the other side can help complete that picture by giving individuals and businesses a choice. And also, I'd remind you of, we had the president of the National Business Coalition on Health yesterday afternoon talk on forging coalitions and alliances with business on this. This is, so this feeds in with that as well. Now, making exchanges successful. Well, there are two public exchanges that exist. In Massachusetts, that's the most similar to the ACA. So we have 160,000 in subsidized coverage and about 40,000 in unsubsidized coverage. Well, only 10,000 of those are covered through their small employers. So their small employer exchange is very small. And if you look at Utah's, only about 2,000 are covered. So the two closest exchanges that have been set up have had trouble distinguishing themselves and have had trouble showing that they have more value in the exchange than outside. So it's not easy to set these up and make them successful. However, the ACA will actually give exchanges more support than states acting on their own would have had in the past. But but basically, the exchanges will have to prove that they have better better consumer satisfaction, that they can increase choice, and they have to deliver on cost savings relatively soon. So those setting up the exchanges have got to be very closely focused on that. They have to show benefits very soon, or end up with a very, very small enrollment and the small group market pretty much as it is now. Okay, so on the last bullet, that has actually been changed a bit. So at time of writing, only 14 states had taken action to establish exchanges. That's now at least 16. So with Maryland and New York joining as of yesterday. So yeah, that was particularly good that New York and Washington State, which passed sort of a comprehensive health reform legislation about last month, are states that we've really been working closely with. Okay. As far as the individual mandate and the exchanges, I think actually Yeah, given the uncertainty, so basically this result was what happens if you take health reform and strike the mandate but leave everything else in place. Since that's only one of several outcomes, I think actually it would be more useful to take time for questions and answers rather than going through that, which may very well be completely obsolete. Okay, so do we have questions? Yes.
Matt, it's been suggested to me that one of the ways to look at the exchanges is to think of something online like orbits.
Mm-hmm.
And what orbits is to airfares and flights and choices is what the exchange would be to healthcare. Is that a fair analogy?
Yes, that is certainly the intention. And health plan design is, of course, far more complicated than booking an airfare. So for example, if your patients are interested in having chiropractic covered, they'll look through, they'll be able to compare side by side these benefits, and they'll say, okay, well, here's the chiropractic coverage in this plan is far better. And if employers get interested in that, in the cost-saving aspect of that, they can make their choices appropriately as well. Yes.
You mentioned how the states or this act was going to provide support for states in how they create small business exchanges.
Yes.
Is there any support for small businesses to actually enter into exchanges, or is there? I mean, one of the impressions that I've gotten is that there's kind of a hesitation that small businesses are actually just going to cut all health insurance and then put that on the employees now that there's a better individual market.
There have been, so basically there are there are tax credits for the smallest businesses, but other than that, as far as attracting them into the exchange, the idea is that the exchange as a better marketplace, as one that will pool risk and make health insurance affordable for more small businesses, that will draw people in. So it puts the burden on the exchange to actually produce value. And to some extent gives it the ability to do so. Now, as far as employers dropping, keep in mind only a small fraction of workers would qualify for subsidized coverage, and things like, for example, smokers would, even under subsidized coverage, smokers would pay much higher premiums. Mm-hmm. So the number of people who would benefit from dumping your current ESI offer and going into the exchange are likely to be a minority of workers in your firm. Granted that there are some firms who would benefit for that and some that would who would do it. Particularly in small firms, you may have 2 or 3, and that may be enough to swing that decision. But only a minority of workers would actually be better off in the individual exchanges without their employer contributions.
Okay. And I have one other question. You
Go
had
ahead.
mentioned how premiums could only really be dictated by 3 major factors: age, tobacco, and geography.
Mm-hmm.
Does then that not also, is that just discounting entirely then the coverage options of that plan? Like if they're offering chiropractic and they're offering different services versus one that's really bare bones, there's going to be a distinction in that as well.
Right. The limitation was on the variation in premiums that could be charged by a plan to individuals. So two plans can have 2 different premium levels.
Right.
What this regulates is one plan charging different premiums to different people.
Got it.
Okay. So that's. So to clarify it, it restricts that.
Thank you.
It doesn't restrict between plan variations. So.
If there's enough time, I actually have one more.
Okay. Go ahead.
You mentioned how there are going to be kind of coverage for everyone that are in these plans. So for something like chiropractic coverage, there's a lot of chiropractors that exist out of networks.
Right.
Just because being inside of an insurance network kind of means you have to play by those rules. And a lot of the insurance companies have kind of turned to the providers as a way for them to save money. So they've cut down reimbursements to the providers to the point where it doesn't even make sense for me to go into network. I could barely make my costs. So is there any also mandate for then out-of-network coverage as well?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because Yeah, because in the regulations on those actuarial value computations, which that just came out a few weeks ago, it wasn't really directive. It was just one of those silly bulletin things that we've heard so much about. Basically, they said that they intend to exclude out-of-network costs in that actuarial value computation, which in other words gives insurers a lot of freedom to set what the copays are outside of network and still qualify for their actuarial
Exchanges.
value tier.
Right.
So how that plays out is definitely something to watch and to keep an eye on. But some of the other things like the ACOs and the medical homes are ways that your practice could be more in network.
Right.
So the goal would be to use those to move yourself in network.